Growing up, I was strictly forbidden from playing in the river that ran through the nearby woods. It was the same for all the neighborhood children. Nobody cared if we climbed on rocks and trees. Heck, there was one kid who would always try and shoot birds with a slingshot, and apparently that was just fine. But if we even dared to mention the river around our parents, they would break into a lecture about how we'd be in big trouble if we were ever to go near it. And now, in every youth's life, there is a time during which they seek to revolt. This phase can result in the strangest behavior, and believe me, I've seen a lot, like my friend Holly, who thought it was a good idea to pierce her ears herself. And my rebellion, however, was much simpler. All I needed was to test some of the rules constituted by my mother and father, just to prove to myself and them that they weren't always right. That's why one night while my parents were away, I put on some weatherproof clothes, grabbed my father's flashlight, and marched out the door right into the woods. My destination was the river. I really wasn't expecting a lot. My parents had never given me any reason not to go there, apart from it being dangerous. It had always seemed excessive to me. The river wasn't deep enough to drown in it, and as far as I knew, there weren't any kinds of undercurrents that could have been a threat to us either. I figured my mother and father were just being paranoid, though it sure was an oddly specific fear. Still, as I ventured into the woods that night, the beam of the torch illuminating the path ahead of me, I was quite excited, a little nervous even. I found myself unable to stop fidgeting with the multiple zippers on my jacket, and every little noise the dark forest produced, be it the crunching of leaves under my own shoes, or a twig snapping in the distance, causing me to jump. But it wasn't as scary as it was exhilarating, kind of like watching a horror movie. I knew I was close when I could hear water running. Shining my flashlight ahead, I could already make out the shimmering, rippling surface of the dark river. I had only ever looked at it from afar. Just walking up to it was enough to make me shudder. I eventually came down to a halt near the water's edge and stared down at it. It was beautiful. The light of the full moon was shining down through the canopy of leaves above and was reflected by the babbling stream. I slowly bent down, careful not to lose my footing and fall in. I raked my hand through the cold water, letting it flow through my fingers and wash out the sweat that had formed on my palm. I stayed like that for a whole minute, almost entranced by the calm sounds of the woods and the river. I remember thinking it would be a nice spot to set up camp for a night. Sleeping there would probably be wonderful. And that's when I heard it. The splashing of a body moving through the stream, pushing the water aside. I jumped to my feet, quickly wiping my hand dry on my jeans so I could firmly cling to the flashlight again. Its beam illuminated a large figure right in front of me, standing in the shallow end of the river just a few steps ahead. It was a stout black horse, easily the biggest one I'd ever seen. Its long, dripping wet mane was so long it almost looked to be touching the ground when it lowered its head. Its round, dark eyes had a soft, gentle sheen to them. Had I been an adult, I might have wondered what in the world a horse like that was doing out in the woods in the middle of the night. Back then, however, my first thought was something akin to, "It's so pretty." I'm sure I was asking myself how it got there as well, but I wasn't wary of it, let alone scared. The horse appeared to be very calm and tame as well, making no moves to distance itself or even change its position at all. Instead, it shook its head into my direction almost curiously. I took a few cautious steps towards it. It stayed right where it was. My trembling hand outstretched, I continued to approach it. When I was close enough to touch it, I carefully placed my hand on its neck, not sure where else to pet it. To my surprise, it leaned into the touch, turning its head to give me that trustful, sweet-tempered look again. I remember thinking that if there was ever a perfect moment, this was it. I turned to pet its side as well. Its fur was wet, but soft and oddly pleasant to the touch. I was standing on the dry riverbank at the time, the horse just below me. I started to toy with the idea of climbing onto its back. I was in an elevated position. I could probably jump up there. Still, I figured it wasn't a good idea. I didn't want to startle this huge animal. That was until it suddenly bent down a little. Unsure of what it wanted, I took a step back. The horse's head turned to face me again. I'm not sure how best to describe it, but it almost looked encouraging. Suddenly, I had this urge, like I for some reason needed to sit on its back. I had to know what it was like. I simply had to. I tucked away my flashlight and, with some effort, hoisted myself up. It took me a little while, but once I had finally crawled onto the horse's back, it straightened up again. I instinctively leaned down to hug its neck, only then realizing how far up I was and having nothing else to grab onto. Before I could give it any thought, however, the large animal had already started to walk. My former enthusiasm about this whole thing had already started to fade, but as the horse took up running, the truth of how I would probably not get off it unscathed began to sink in. I had never done horseback riding before, so I had no clue how to get it to slow down. Plus, what was I supposed to do with no reins? Shouted it to stop. I tried, but it wasn't very effective. Panicking, I figured my only chance would be to jump. At that point, the horse was practically racing through the river. We were still on the very shallow side of it, so there wasn't enough water to slow it down. The clopping and splashing of its hooves felt almost deafening. Still, we were close enough to the dry ground for me to land safely. Bracing myself, I began lifting my left leg over the horse's back, ready to swing myself down, only to realize in horror that I couldn't. I was stuck. I could move my legs and the rest of my body, but my hands, which had been clutching the animal's neck, were basically glued to it. It was as if they were fixed to its fur. The horse was picking up its pace, dashing through the water. Had I not been sealed in place, there was no way I would have been able to hold on to it. And worse yet, it was beginning to pull over into the deeper part of the river. We had left the area that was familiar to me a long time ago already. The woods had started clearing up, and there were less and less trees on our way, just wide green plains. I knew that the river would get deeper further out, too deep for someone to stand in it, but I would have never gone there on my own. How could this thing even swim so fast? The reality of this creature not being what it seemed was becoming painfully obvious. Looking down at it, I found that its body was starting to change, almost like it was morphing into something else, something less earthly. It had begun to slim, enough for its ribs to show. And glancing over my shoulder at its rear end, I saw that it had elongated, now looking like a fish's tail or the body of a snake, just enormous. It was plowing through the water, sending waves up the riverbank. I was already submerged from my hip and below. Soon, it would be all the way up to my neck. I started to cry and scream, even though I knew nobody would hear me out here. The more that I thrashed around on its back, the faster this water spirit seemed to go, almost like it knew what I was doing. I needed to get my hands loose. It was my only chance. My mind was already racing with thoughts of drowning, water filling my lungs and keeping me from breathing. I wasn't going to die like that. I started to pull back with all my might. My palms were firmly attached to the fur, as if each and every single hair in that spot had drilled itself under my skin. Still, I didn't stop. I needed to get loose. Gritting my teeth, I stiffened my arms and threw back my upper body. I let out a howl of agony as I felt the skin of my palms rip, but I didn't stop. I leaned even further back, pulling against the fur's grip using my entire weight. And then suddenly, an even sharper sting of pain. It hit so much that it felt like someone had set my arms on fire, but I forced myself to ignore it. I swung myself off the horse's back. I didn't notice it right away, so I swam over to the riverbank as fast as I could. Thankfully, it wasn't too far. The icy water felt both good and torturous on my skinned hands. The cold soothed my burning nerves, but every time I pushed the water aside to move forward, it seemed to press back against the wounds. By the time that I was out of the water, the horse was still on its original course, and it was only when I took off running that it appeared to take note of my absence. Staggering through the darkness, praying not to trip over anything, I heard the creature let out an ungodly sound. It was reminiscent of a neigh, but warped, distorted, and way too deep. I pressed on, my only aim being to get as far away from the water as possible. I did not know if it would follow me through the woods, but I could already make out the splashing of water behind me in the distance, quickly replaced by the clopping of hooves. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw that the horse had just gotten out of the river, but it was still not even close to me. Once it would start to run, I knew that I wouldn't stand a chance. I had to look for something else, a way to hide. My best bet were the trees. The creature could swim, but chances were it couldn't climb. I couldn't really see which trees would be easy to climb up on, since they were all just shadowy silhouettes in the darkness. But as I was running out of options, I headed from the tree with the lowest hanging branches. I was never very strong, but adrenaline does funny things to your body. I grabbed onto the lowest and thickest branch that I could reach, the bark painfully scraping my skin palms, and pulled myself up to sit on it, with surprisingly little difficulty. Not wanting to take any chances, I climbed a little higher, now safely out of reach from my pursuer. I moved all the way up to the trunk, keeping my arms around it in hopes of steadying myself in place. Looking down, I spotted movement. As dark as it was, there was no way I would have overlooked the shimmer of the false horse's fur. It looked normal again, gracefully circling my tree. It readied itself to jump, and I winced as it lapped, but it missed me by a little over 3 feet and landed quite unceremoniously in the dirt below. After that, it trotted off again, and I was left by myself, staring after it. I waited for what felt like hours. By the time I finally dared to get off that tree, my thighs felt like someone had shoved iron rods into them. My walk home was long and tedious and stiff. The pain in my hands had subsided a little, leaving behind a throbbing sensation. I didn't dare look at the wounds. Instead, I focused on getting out of the woods. The water had rendered my flashlight useless, but I still found myself in a street that I had recognized soon enough. From there on out, it took me 2 hours to get back to my house. My parents were waiting for me inside. My mother only needed to take a single look at me to come running and throw her arms around me. She didn't seem to care that I was soaking wet and caked in mud. Upon discovering my hands, she let out a cry of terror. "Did you go to the river?" she gasped, placing her hands on my cheeks. I nodded, too defeated to speak. "My poor girl," she whimpered as she hugged me again. "This is all our fault. We should have just told you. I knew it was a mistake, making it all mysterious. I just hoped that you would leave it alone." "Do you know that you could have died out there?" my father inquired, his tone sharp. I could see the tears in his eyes, though. "My grandfather told me of a little boy who had to cut his fingers off to get away from it. One touch can be enough to bind the skin, sometimes even the flesh. And if you can't tear yourself loose, it's over. It'll drag you down, drown you, and eat you." My mother petted my hair, burying her face against my shoulder. "Thank God you're okay. We were already worried when we saw that you were gone. But your shoes and jacket were gone too, and the door was locked, so we figured you would have just gone out with a friend." "What was that thing?" I asked breathlessly. My father bit his lip, raking one hand through his hair, the other one still busy keeping him on his feet by clinging to the corner of the shelf beside him. "We call it a kelpie,"